And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Looking at tonight's weather again, next system pushing into the western Bering Sea and the Aleutians here with rain spreading in across Adak and Atka later tonight. Beyond that, to the east there, a weak trough bringing some light rain, fog, and drizzle into the Pribilof Islands. Otherwise, this low tracking across Kodiak Island overnight tonight, moving into the western Gulf here. They're to about this position, south of the Kenai Peninsula. After midnight tonight, rain across all southern Alaska, some of which will actually spill a little bit north of the Alaska Range there to some extent, but mostly dry with the showers ending up here in the northern interior. Weak system bringing a chance of some isolated showers to the western Arctic coast, and these showers moving out of the area. Rain and wind increasing, especially along the north coast, with gale force winds developing for the North Gulf Coast later tonight. And then tomorrow, wind and rain push into the Panhandle all the way down with that front into the Dixon entrance area. Rain back in across south central Alaska, Copper River Basin, and into the Kuskokwim Valley, tapering off, especially in the afternoon, becoming just some scattered isolated showers here back toward the southwest coast. Look for some afternoon clearing with northwest winds there for Kodiak Island. And just isolated showers in the Alaska Peninsula. This front weakening quite a bit here as the low center slowly moves northeastward. This front weakens with just a chance of rain moving eastward, but holding together enough to bring some rain and breezy conditions into the Pribilof Islands. Then on the next day, another system pushes into the western Bering Sea, and a wave develops along the front there, and that'll bring increasing winds here to the central Aleutian areas as this front washes out along the southwest coast. This low forecast to track right on up into the be off the Yukon Delta coast on the day late Saturday and Sunday, and that'll bring gale force winds with it and higher seas along the coastline there. So maybe some high surf advisories at least there later in the weekend. Otherwise, this low on Friday moving into the Panhandle, periods of rain with that front right in the area there, extending back to Yakutat, but drying out over south central Alaska with increasing sunshine and decreasing showers, but stays pretty cloudy and damp here and unsettled over the eastern Copper River Basin up into the upper Tanana Valley 40-mile country, but drying out back to the north and to the west. For the coastal water forecast, south winds 25 to 30 knots. And developing gales as you head north here tomorrow with east-southeast winds 35 to 45 knots there for the north coast, with those seas building 13 to 18 feet. And for Lynn Canal, southeast winds 25 gusting 40 knots, small craft advisories for the central and southern inside channels for southeast winds at 25 knots. And then lighter winds coming in on Friday with the front weakening and lying right across the southeast coast there. Southwest behind the front about 20 knots on the south coast. Otherwise south to southeast 15 knots on the central coast. Of the north coast, variable winds 10 to 15 knots. Lynn Canal, winds south at 10 knots. Clarence Strait, northwest at 10. And southeast winds 15 knots for Stevens Passage. Prince William Sound, northeast winds 25 knots with 4-foot seas. East-northeasterly gales tomorrow for the eastern North Gulf Coast, 35 to 45 knots, seas 14 to 16 feet. North winds at 40 knots with 12-foot seas there for the western North Gulf Coast. Gale warnings also for the Barren Islands for north winds at 35 knots and small craft advisory, southern Cook Inlet and Kamishak Bay for north to northwest winds at 30 knots. And for Friday, Cook Inlet, northwest winds 10 to 15 knots. Small craft advisories, Kamishak Bay here in the Barren Islands, west-northwest winds at 25 knots with 7-foot seas. And north winds at about 10 knots here for Prince William Sound. Light variable winds now for the North Gulf Coast, really coming down for what they'll be on Thursday there, just variable at 10, seas subsiding to 5 feet. Northwest winds at 15 knots for the western North Gulf Coast. Kodiak Island, northwest winds 30 to 40 knots with the gales here on the east side of the island, with maybe some higher gusts. And northwest at 30 there for the Bristol Bay area, seas at 8 feet. And for the Alaska Peninsula, west-northwest winds 20 to 30 knots, seas running 4 to 7 feet. And for Friday, Bristol Bay, west winds 20 knots. Kodiak Island, west winds 20 to 25 knots. And the Alaska Peninsula, west-southwest winds at 15 knots with 2 to 4 foot seas. And for the eastern Aleutians, west-southwest winds tomorrow, 15 to 20 knots. Adak and Atka, southwest at 20 to 25 knots, and small craft advisories for the western Aleutians, southwest at 25 knots with seas 9 to 10 feet. And then for the day on Friday, small craft advisories continue for the western Aleutians, winds still 25 knots out of the southwest with seas 8 to 10 feet. 30 knot south winds now for Adak and Atka with seas 5 to 8 feet. And small craft advisories for the eastern Aleutians, south to southwest winds at 20 to 30 knots. And for the southwest coast, looking at northwest winds, 10 to 20 knots here with seas only 2 to 3 feet. Variable at 20 knots for the Pribilof, seas 4 feet. South at 15, St. Matthew Island, seas 5 feet. And Norton Sound, looking at north winds at 15 knots, northwest at 10 for St. Lawrence Island. And for the day Friday, Norton Sound, west winds at 10 knots, south winds 15 knots for St. Lawrence Island, the Yukon Delta coast, south at 10 for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, and south winds 20 knots for the Pribilofs and St. Matthew Island. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, east winds 25 knots, seas 4 feet, east at 20 for the central coast here with 4 foot seas, northeast winds 10 to 15 knots with 2 to 3 foot seas for the western Arctic coast. Chukchi Sea, northeast at 5, seas at 2 feet. And then for the day on Friday, we've got west winds at 10 knots for the Chukchi Sea, and the western Arctic coast, northeast 10 to 15 knots, seas at 2 feet. Central and east side up here, east winds 20 knots.